Part 1. Earth. The things that are solid, absorbed, and still shams. An inn outside Samarkand, March 1242. Beeswax candles flickered in front of my eyes above the cracked wooden table. The vision that took hold of me this evening was a most lucid one. There was a big house with a courtyard full of yellow roses in bloom, and in the middle of the courtyard a well with the coolest water in the world. It was a serene, late autumn night with a full moon in the sky. A few nocturnal animals hooted and howled in the background. In a little while, a middle-aged man with a kind face, broad shoulders, and deep-set hazel eyes walked out of the house, looking for me. His expression was vexed, and his eyes were immensely sad. "Shams, Shams, where are you?" he shouted left and right. The wind blew hard, and the moon hid behind a cloud, as if it didn't want to witness what was about to happen. The owls stopped hooting, the bats stopped flapping their wings, and even the fire in the hearth inside the house did not crackle. An absolute stillness descended upon the world. The man slowly approached the well, bent over, and looked down below. "Shams, dearest," he whispered. "Are you there?" I opened my mouth to answer, but no sound came out of my lips. The man leaned closer and looked down into the well again. At first he couldn't see anything other than the darkness of the water. But then, deep down at the bottom of the well, he caught sight of my hand floating aimlessly on the rippling water like a rickety raft after a heavy storm. Next he recognized a pair of eyes, two shiny black stones, staring up at the full moon now coming out from behind thick, dark clouds. My eyes were fixed on the moon as if waiting for an explanation from the skies for my murder. The man fell on his knees, crying and pounding his chest. "They killed him! They killed my Shams!" he yelled. Just then a shadow scurried out from behind a bush, and with fast, furtive moves it hopped over the garden wall, like a wildcat. But the man didn't notice the killer. Seized by a crushing pain, he screamed and screamed until his voice shattered like glass and flew all over into the night in tiny, prickly shards. "Hey, you! Stop screaming like a maniac! Cut that awful noise or I am going to kick you out!" I said. "Shut up! Do you hear me? Shut up!" It was a male voice that shouted these words, booming menacingly close. I pretended not to hear him, preferring to stay inside my vision for at least a bit longer. I wanted to learn more about my death. I also wanted to see the man with the saddest eyes. Who was he? How was he related to me? And why was he so desperately looking for me on an autumn night? But before I could sneak another look at my vision, someone from the other dimension grabbed me by the arm and shook me so hard I felt my teeth rattle in my mouth. It yanked me back into this world. Slowly, reluctantly, I opened my eyes and saw the person standing beside me. He was a tall, corpulent man with a hoary beard and thick mustache, curved and pointy at the tips. I recognized him as the innkeeper. Almost instantly I noticed two things about him: that he was a man used to intimidating people with tough talk and sheer violence. And that right now he was furious. "What do you want?" I asked. "Why are you pulling my arm?" "What do I want?" the innkeeper roared with a scowl. "I want you to stop screaming, for starters, that's what I want. You are scaring away my customers." "Really, have I been screaming?" I muttered as I managed to pull myself free from his grip. "You bet you were. You were screaming like a bear with a thorn stuck in its paw. What happened to you? Did you doze off during dinner? You must have had a nightmare or something." I knew that this was the only plausible explanation, and if I went along with it, the innkeeper would be satisfied and leave me in peace. Still, I did not want to lie. "No, brother, I have neither fallen asleep nor had a bad dream," I said. "Actually, I never have dreams." "How do you explain all that screaming?" then the innkeeper wanted to know. I had a vision. That's different. He gave me a bewildered look and sucked on the ends of his mustache for a while. Finally he said, "You dervishes are as crazy as rats in a pantry. Especially you wandering types. All day long you fast and pray and walk under the scorching sun. No wonder you start hallucinating, your brain is fried." I smiled. He could be right. They say there is a thin line between losing yourself in God and losing your mind. 2 serving boys appeared just then, carrying between them a huge tray stacked with plates, freshly grilled goat, dried salted fish, spiced mutton, wheat cakes, chickpeas with meatballs, and lentil soup with sheep's tail fat. They went around the hall distributing them, filling the air with the scents of onion, garlic, and spices. When they stopped by my end of the table, I got myself a bowl of steaming soup and some dark bread. "Do you have money to pay for those?" the innkeeper asked, with a flicker of condescension. "No, I don't," I said. "But allow me to offer an exchange. In return for the food and the room, I could interpret your dreams." To this he responded with a sneer, his arms akimbo, "You just told me you never had dreams." That's right. I am a dream interpreter who doesn't have dreams of his own. I should toss you out of here. "Like I said, you dervishes are nuts," the innkeeper said, spitting out the words. "Here is some advice for you. I don't know how old you are, but I'm sure you have prayed enough for both worlds. Find a nice woman and settle down. Have children. That will help to keep your feet on the ground. What is the point of roaming the world when it's the same misery everywhere? Trust me, there is nothing new out there. I have customers from the farthest corners of the world. After a few drinks, I hear the same stories from them all. Men are the same everywhere. Same food, same water, same old crap. I'm not looking for something different. I'm looking for God," I said. "My quest is a quest for God." "Then you are looking for him in the wrong place," he retorted, his voice suddenly thickened. "God has left this place. We don't know when he will be back." My heart flailed away at my chest wall upon hearing this. "When one speaks ill of God, he speaks ill of himself," I said. An odd, slanted smile edged along the innkeeper's mouth. In his face I saw bitterness and indignation, and something else that resembled childish hurt. "Doesn't God say, 'I am closer to you than your jugular vein'?" I asked. "God is not some place far up in the sky. He is inside each and every one of us. That is why he never abandons us. How can he abandon himself?" "But he does abandon," the innkeeper remarked, his eyes cold and defiant. "If God is here but does not move a finger when we suffer the worst ends, what does that tell us about him?" "It is the first rule, brother," I said. "How we see God is a direct reflection of how we see ourselves. If God brings to mind mostly fear and blame, it means there is too much fear and blame welled inside us. If we see God as full of love and compassion, so are we." The innkeeper immediately objected, but I could see that my words had surprised him. "How is that any different than saying God is a product of our imagination? I don't get it." But my answer was interrupted by a ruckus that broke out at the back of the dining hall. When we turned in that direction, we saw 2 rough-looking men yelling drunken gibberish. With unbridled insolence they were bullying the other customers, snatching food off their bowls, drinking from their cups, and, should anyone protest, mocking them like 2 naughty maktab boys. "Somebody should take care of these troublemakers, don't you think?" hissed the innkeeper between clenched teeth. "Now, watch me." In a flash he reached the end of the hall, yanked one of the drunken customers from his seat, and punched him in the face. The man must not have been expecting this at all, for he collapsed on the floor like an empty sack. A barely audible sigh came out of his lips, but other than that he made no noise. The other man proved stronger, and he fiercely fought back, but it didn't take the innkeeper long to knock him down, too. He kicked his unruly customer in the ribs and then stomped on his hand, grinding it under his heavy boots. We heard the crack of a finger breaking, or maybe more. "Stop it!" I exclaimed. "You are going to kill him. Is that what you want?" As a Sufi I had sworn to protect life and do no harm. In this world of illusions, so many people were ready to fight without any reason, and so many others fought for a reason. But the Sufi was the one who wouldn't fight even if he had a reason. There was no way I could resort to violence. But I could thrust myself like a soft blanket between the innkeeper and the customers to keep them apart. "You stay out of this, dervish, or I'll beat the hell out of you, too," the innkeeper shouted, but we both knew he wasn't going to do that. A minute later, when the serving boys lifted up the two customers, one of them had a broken finger and the other a broken nose, and there was blood all over. A fearful silence descended on the dining hall. Proud with the awe he inspired, the innkeeper gave me a sidelong look. When he spoke again, it sounded as if he were addressing everyone around, his voice soaring high and wild, like a marauder bird boasting in the open sky. "You see, dervish, it wasn't always like this. Violence wasn't my element, but it is now. When God forgets about us down here, it falls upon us common people to toughen up and restore justice. So next time you talk to him, you tell him that. Let him know that when he abandons his lambs, they won't meekly wait to be slaughtered. They will turn into wolves." I shrugged as I motioned toward the door. "You are mistaken. Am I wrong in saying I was a lamb once and have turned into a wolf?" "No, you got that right. I can see that you have become a wolf indeed. But you are wrong in calling what you are doing justice. Wait, I haven't finished with you," the innkeeper shouted behind my back. "You owe me. In return for food and bed, you were going to interpret my dreams." "I'll do something better," I suggested. "I'll read your palm." I turned back and walked toward him, looking hard into his burning eyes. Instinctively, distrustfully, he flinched. Still, when I grabbed his right hand and turned his palm up, he didn't push me away. I inspected the lines and found them deep, cracked, marking uneven paths bit by bit. The colors in his aura appeared to me, a rusty brown and a blue so pale as to be almost gray. His spiritual energy was hollowed out and thinned around the edges, as if it had no more strength to defend itself against the outside world. Deep inside, the man was no more alive than a wilting plant. To make up for the loss of his spiritual energy, he had doubled up his physical energy, which he used in excess. My heart beat faster, for I had started seeing something. At first dimly, as if behind a veil, then with increasing clarity, a scene appeared in front of my eyes. A young woman with chestnut hair, bare feet with black tattoos, and an embroidered red shawl draped over her shoulders. "You have lost a loved one," I said, and took his left palm in my hand. Her breasts swollen with milk and her belly so huge it looks as if it could rip apart. She is stuck in a hut on fire. There are warriors around the house, riding horses with silver-gilded saddles. The thick smell of burning hay and human flesh. Mongol riders, their noses flat and wide, necks thick and short, and hearts as hard as rocks. The mighty army of Genghis Khan. "You have lost 2 loved ones," I corrected myself. "Your wife was pregnant with your first child." His eyebrows clamped down, his eyes fixed on his leather boots, and his lips tightly pursed. The innkeeper's face creased into an unreadable map. Suddenly he looked old beyond his years. I realize that it's no consolation to you, but I think there is something you should know, I said. It wasn't the fire or the smoke that killed her. It was a wooden plank in the ceiling that collapsed on her head. She died instantly, without any pain. You always assumed she had suffered terribly, but in reality she did not suffer at all. The innkeeper furrowed his brow, bowed under a pressure only he could understand. His voice turned raspy as he asked, "How do you know all that?" I ignored the question. "You have been blaming yourself for not giving her a proper funeral. You still see her in your dreams, crawling out of the pit she was buried in. But your mind is playing games with you. In truth, your wife and son are both fine, traveling in infinity, as free as a speck of light." I then added, measuring each word, "You can become a lamb again, because you still have it in you." Upon hearing this, the innkeeper pulled his hand away, as if he had just touched a sizzling pan. "I don't like you, dervish," he said. "I'll let you stay here tonight. But make sure you are gone early in the morning. I don't want to see your face around here again. It was always like this. When you spoke the truth, they hated you. The more you talked about love, the more they hated you. Ella. Northampton, May 18, 2008. Bested by the tension that followed the argument with David and Jeanette, Ella was so drained she had to stop reading Sweet Blasphemy for a while. She felt as though the lid of a boiling cauldron had suddenly been lifted, emitting old conflicts and new resentments in the rising steam. Unfortunately, it was no one other than she who had lifted that lid. And she had done it by dialing Scott's number and asking him not to marry her daughter. Later in her life, she would deeply regret everything she uttered during this phone conversation. But on this day in May, she was so sure of herself and the ground beneath her feet that she could not for the life of her fathom any dire consequences from her intrusion. "Hi, Scott. This is Jeanette's mom, Ella," she said, trying to sound jovial, as if calling her daughter's boyfriend were something she did all the time. "Do you have a minute to talk?" "Mrs. Rubenstein, how may I help you?" Scott stammered, surprised but ever so civilized. And in a no less civilized tone, Ella told him that although she had nothing against him personally, he was too young and inexperienced to marry her daughter. Upset as he might be to receive this call now, she added, someday in the not-so-distant future he would understand and even thank her for warning him in time. Until then she asked him to kindly drop the subject of marriage and to keep this phone conversation between the two of them. There was a thick, dense silence. "Mrs. Rubenstein, I don't think you understand," Scott said when he finally found his voice. "Jeanette and I love each other." There it was again. How could people be naive enough to expect love to open every door for them? They looked at love as if it were a magic wand that could fix everything with one miraculous touch. But Ella didn't say any of this. Instead she said, "I understand how you feel, believe me, I do. But you are too young and life is long. Who knows, tomorrow you might fall in love with someone else." "Mrs. Rubenstein, I don't want to be rude, but don't you think the same rule applies to everyone, including yourself? Who knows, tomorrow you, too, might fall in love with someone else." Ella chuckled, louder and longer than she intended. "I'm a married woman. I've made a choice for a lifetime. So did my husband. And that's exactly my point. Marriage is a serious decision, which needs to be considered very carefully. Are you telling me not to marry your daughter, who I love, because I might love an unidentified other in an indefinite future?" Scott demanded. The conversation went downhill from there, filled with distress and disappointment. When they finally hung up, Ella headed to the kitchen and did what she always did at times of emotional unrest: she cooked. Half an hour later, she received a call from her husband. I can't believe you called Scott to ask him not to marry our daughter. Tell me you didn't do this. Ella gasped. Wow, word gets out fast. Honey, let me explain. But David interjected tensely, there is nothing to explain. What you did was wrong. Scott told Jeanette, and now she's extremely upset. She'll be staying with her friends for a few days. She doesn't want to see you right now. He paused briefly. And I don't blame her. That evening Jeanette wasn't the only one who didn't come home. David sent Ella a text message informing her of a sudden emergency that had arisen. There was no explanation as to the nature of the emergency. It was so unlike him and against the spirit of their marriage. He might flirt with woman after woman, could even sleep with them and spend his money on them for all she knew, but he had always come home and taken his place at the table in the evenings. No matter how deep the rift between them, she always cooked and he always ate, gladly and gratefully, whatever she put on his plate. At the end of each dinner, David never failed to thank her a heartfelt thank you that she always took to be a coded apology for his infidelities. She forgave him. She always did. This was the first time her husband had acted this brazen, and Ella blamed herself for the change. But then again, guilt was Ella Rubinstein's middle name. When she sat at the table with her twins, Ella's guilt gave way to melancholy. She resisted Abby's pleas to order pizza and Orly's attempts not to eat anything, forcing them to munch on wild rice with green peas and roast beef with mustard glaze. And although on the surface she was the same hands-on, concerned mother, she felt a surge of despair rise in her, a sharp taste in her mouth, sour like bile. When dinner was over, Ella sat at the kitchen table on her own, finding the stillness around her heavy and unsettling. Suddenly the food she had cooked, the outcome of hours of hard work, seemed not only dull and boring but easily replaceable. She felt sorry for herself. It was a pity that, at almost 40, she hadn't been able to make more of her life. She had so much love to give and yet no one demanding it. Her thoughts turned to sweet blasphemy. She was intrigued by the character of Shams of Tabriz. It could be nice to have someone like him around, she joked to herself. Never a dull day with a guy like him. And somehow the image that popped up in her mind was of a tall, dark-looking, mysterious man with leather pants, a motorcycle jacket, and black hair that fell to his shoulders, riding a shiny red Harley-Davidson with multicolored tassels hanging from the handlebars. She smiled at the image. A handsome, sexy, Sufi motorcyclist riding fast on an empty highway. Wouldn't it be nice to get picked up while hitchhiking by a guy like that? Ella then wondered what Shams would see if he read her palm. Would he explain to her why her mind turned from time to time into a coven of dark thoughts, or how come she felt so lonely even though she had a large, loving family? What about the colors in her aura? Were they bright and bold? Had anything in her life been bright and bold lately, or ever? It was then and there, while sitting alone at the kitchen table with only a faint glimmer of light from the oven, that Ella realized that despite her high-flying words denying it, and despite her ability to keep a stiff upper lip, deep inside she longed for love. Shams. An inn outside Samarkand, March 1242. Burdened with loneliness, all fast asleep in separate dreams, were more than a dozen weary travelers upstairs at the inn. I stepped over bare feet and hands to reach my empty bedroll that reeked of sweat and mold. I lay there in the dark, mulling over the day's events and reflecting on any divine signs I might have witnessed but, in my haste or ignorance, failed to appreciate. Since I was a boy, I had received visions and heard voices. I always talked to God, and He always responded. Some days I ascended all the way up to the seventh sky as light as a whisper. Then I descended into the deepest pits of the earth, suffused with the smells of soil, hidden away like a rock buried under mighty oaks and sweet chestnuts. Every so often I lost my appetite for food and went without eating for days on end. None of these things scared me, though in time I had learned not to mention them to others. Human beings tended to disparage what they couldn't comprehend. I had learned that firsthand. The first person to misjudge my visions was my father. I must have been 10 years old when I started seeing my guardian angel on a daily basis and was naive enough to think that everyone else did as well. One day, while my father was teaching me how to build a cedar chest so that I could become a carpenter like him, I told him about my guardian angel. "You have a wild imagination, son," my father said dryly. "And you better keep it to yourself. We don't want to upset the villagers again." A few days before, the neighbors had complained about me to my parents, accusing me of acting strange and scaring their kids. "I don't understand your ways, my son. Why can't you accept that you are no more remarkable than your parents?" my father asked. "Every child takes after his father and mother. So have you." That was when I realized that although I loved my parents and craved their love, they were strangers to me. "Father, I am from a different egg than your other children. Think of me as a duckling raised by hens. I am not a domestic bird destined to spend his life in a chicken coop. The water that scares you rejuvenates me. For unlike you I can swim, and swim I shall. The ocean is my homeland. If you are with me, come to the ocean. If not, stop interfering with me and go back to the chicken coop." My father's eyes grew large, then small, and distant. "If this is the way you talk to your father now," he said gravely, "I wonder how you will address your enemies when you grow up." Much to the chagrin of my parents, the visions did not disappear as I got older. If anything, they became more intense and gripping. I knew I made my parents nervous, and I felt guilty for upsetting them so, but the truth is, I didn't know how to end the visions, and even if I had, I don't think I would have. Before long I left my house for good. Since then Tabriz has become a smooth, sweet word, so fine and delicate that it melts on my tongue. 3 scents accompany my memories of this place: cut wood, poppy seed bread, and the soft, crisp smell of snow. I have been a wandering dervish ever since, not sleeping in the same place more than once, not eating out of the same bowl twice in a row, every day seeing different faces around me. When hungry, I earn a few coins by interpreting dreams. In this state I roam east and west, searching for God high and low. I hunt everywhere for a life worth living and a knowledge worth knowing. Having roots nowhere, I have everywhere to go. During my travels I have taken all sorts of roads, from popular trade routes to forgotten tracks where you wouldn't run into a soul for days on end. From the coasts of the Black Sea to the cities of Persia, from the vast steppes of Central Asia to the sand dunes of Arabia, I have passed through thick forests, flat grasslands, and deserts, sojourned at caravansaries and hostels, consulted with the learned men in age-old libraries, listened to tutors teaching little children in maktabs, discussed tafsir and logic with students in madrasas, visited temples, monasteries, and shrines, meditated with hermits in their caves, performed zikr with dervishes, fasted with sages and dined with heretics, danced with shamans under the full moon, come to know people of all faiths, ages, and professions, and witnessed misfortunes and miracles alike. I have seen poverty-stricken villages, fields blackened by fire, and plundered towns where the rivers ran red and there were no men left alive above the age of 10. I have seen the worst and the best in humanity. Nothing surprises me anymore. As I went through all these experiences, I began to compile a list that wasn't written down in any book, only inscribed in my soul. This personal list I called the basic principles of the itinerant mystics of Islam. To me these were as universal, dependable, and invariable as the laws of nature. Together they constituted the 40 rules of the religion of love, which could be attained through love and love only. And one of those rules said, the path to the truth is a labor of the heart, not of the head. Make your heart your primary guide, not your mind. Meet, challenge, and ultimately prevail over your nafs with your heart. Knowing your ego will lead you to the knowledge of God. It had taken me years to finish working on these rules. All 40 of them. And now that I was done, I knew I was nearing the final stage of my time in this world. Lately I had been having many visions in this direction. It wasn't death that worried me, for I didn't see it as an end, but dying without leaving a legacy behind. There were many words piled up inside my chest, stories waiting to be told. I wanted to hand all this knowledge to one other person, neither a master nor a disciple. I sought an equal, a companion. God, I whispered into the dark, damp room, all my life I traveled the world and followed thy path. I saw every person as an open book, a walking Quran. I stayed away from the ivory towers of scholars, preferring to spend time with outcasts, expatriates, and exiles. Now I am bursting. Help me to hand thy wisdom to the right person. Then thou can do with me as thou wish. Before my eyes the room was showered with a light so bright that the faces of the travelers in their beds turned lurid blue. The air inside smelled fresh and alive, as if all the windows had been pushed open and a gusty wind brought in the scent of lilies and jasmine from faraway gardens. Go to Baghdad, fluted my guardian angel in a sing-song voice. What is awaiting me in Baghdad? I asked. You prayed for a companion, and a companion you will be given. In Baghdad you will find the master who will point you in the right direction. Tears of gratitude welled up in my eyes. Now I knew that the man in my vision was no other than my spiritual companion. Sooner or later we were destined to meet. And when we did, I would learn why his kind hazel eyes were eternally sad and how I came to be murdered on an early spring night. Ella. Northampton, May 19, 2008. Before the sun had set and the children had come back home, Ella placed a bookmark in the manuscript and put sweet blasphemy aside. Curious about the man who had written the novel, she went online and googled Az Zahara, wondering what would pop up but not expecting much. To her surprise, a personal blog appeared. The colors on the page were predominantly amethyst and turquoise, and on top of the page a male figure with a long white skirt whirled slowly. Having never seen a whirling dervish before, Ella took a careful look at the picture. The blog was titled An Eggshell Named Life, and beneath it there was a poem with the same title. Let us choose one another as companions. Let us sit at each other's feet. Inwardly we have many harmonies, think not that we are only what we see. The page was full of postcards from cities and sites all around the world. Underneath each postcard there were comments about that particular place. It was while reading these that Ella came across 3 pieces of information that immediately drew her attention. First, that the A in Az Zahara stood for Aziz. Second, that Aziz regarded himself as a Sufi. Third, that at the moment he was traveling somewhere in Guatemala. In another section there were samples of the photos he had taken. Most were portraits of people of all colors and stripes. Despite their stark differences, they resembled one another in one curious respect: all the people in all the portraits had something visibly missing. For some the missing element was a simple thing, like an earring, a shoe, or a button, while for others it was much more substantial, like a tooth, a finger, or sometimes a leg. Underneath the photos it read: no matter who we are or where we live, deep inside we all feel incomplete. It's like we have lost something and need to get it back. Just what that something is, most of us never find out. And of those who do, even fewer manage to go out and look for it. Ella scrolled up and down the web page, clicked on every postcard to enlarge it, and read every comment Aziz had made. At the bottom of the page, there was an email address, azizzahara@gmail.com, which she wrote down on a piece of paper. Next to that she found a poem by Rumi. Choose love, love. Without the sweet life of love, living is a burden, as you have seen. It was while reading this poem that a most peculiar thought flashed across her mind. For a fleeting moment, it felt as if everything Aziz Zahara included in his personal blog, the pictures, the comments, the quotations, and the poems were written for her eyes only. It was a strange and slightly supercilious thought, but one that made perfect sense to her. Later in the afternoon, Ella sat by the window, feeling tired and slightly down, the sun heavy on her back and the air in the kitchen filled with the smells of the brownies she was baking. She had Sweet Blasphemy open in front of her, but her mind was so preoccupied she couldn't concentrate on the manuscript. It occurred to her that perhaps she, too, should write her own set of ground rules. She could name it the 40 Rules of the Deeply Settled, Earthy Housewife. Rule number 1, she murmured. Stop looking for love. Stop running after impossible dreams. There are surely more important things in life for a married woman about to be 40. But her own joke produced an obscure discomfort in Ella, reminding her of bigger worries. Unable to hold herself back anymore, she gave her elder daughter a call. She got her answering machine. Jeanette, dear, I know it was wrong of me to call Scott. But my intentions weren't bad. I just wanted to make sure. She paused, deeply regretting not planning this message in advance. She could hear the soft rustle of the answering machine recording in the background. It made her nervous to think that the tape was rolling and time was running short. Jeanette, I'm sorry for the things I do. I know I shouldn't complain when I'm so blessed. But it's just that I'm so unhappy. Click. The answering machine came to a stop. Ella's heart constricted with the shock of what she'd just said. What had come over her? She hadn't known she was unhappy. Was it possible to be depressed and not know it? Oddly enough, she didn't feel unhappy about confessing her unhappiness. She hadn't been feeling much of anything lately. Her gaze slid to the piece of paper on which she'd written Aziz Zahara's email address. The address looked simple, unpretentious, and somehow inviting. Without giving it much thought, she went to her computer and started composing an email. Dear Aziz Zahara, my name is Ella. I am reading your novel Sweet Blasphemy in my capacity as a reader for the literary agency. I have only just begun, and I am enjoying it immensely. This, however, is my personal opinion and is not reflective of the views of my boss. Whether I like your novel or not, I have barely any influence on the final decision as to whether we will take you on as a client. It seems like you believe that love is the essence of life and that nothing else matters. It's not my intention to get into a fruitless debate with you on this matter. Suffice it to say that I do not completely agree. But this is not why I am writing to you. I am writing because the timing of my reading Sweet Blasphemy couldn't have been more bizarre. Currently I am trying to persuade my elder daughter not to marry so young. The day before, I asked her boyfriend to call off their marriage plans. Now my daughter hates me and refuses to talk to me. I have a feeling you two would get along well, as you seem to have very similar views on love. I am sorry to pour my personal problems out to you. That wasn't my intention. Your personal blog, that is where I found your email address, says you are in Guatemala. Traveling around the world must be quite a thrill. If you happen to come to Boston, perhaps we could meet in person and talk over a cup of coffee. Best wishes, Ella. Her first email to Aziz was not a letter so much as an invitation, a cry for help. But Ella had no way of knowing this, as she sat in the silence of her kitchen and composed a note to an unknown writer she didn't expect to meet now or at any time in the future. The Master. Baghdad, April 1242. Baghdad took no note of the arrival of Shams of Tabriz, but I will never forget the day he came to our modest dervish lodge. We had important guests that afternoon. The High Judge had dropped by with a group of his men, and I suspected there was more than cordiality behind his visit. Renowned for his dislike of Sufism, the judge wanted to remind me that he kept an eye on us, just as he kept an eye on all the Sufis in the area. The judge was an ambitious man. He had a broad face, a sagging belly, and short, stubby fingers, each with a precious ring. He had to stop eating so much, but I suspected that nobody had the courage to tell him, not even his doctor. Coming from a long line of religious scholars, he was one of the most influential men in the area. With one ruling he could send a man to the gallows, or he could just as easily pardon a convict's crimes, lifting him up from the darkest dungeons. Always dressed in fur coats and expensive garments, he carried himself with the grandeur of someone who was sure of his authority. I did not approve of his big ego, but for the well-being of our lodge I did my best to remain on good terms with this man of influence. "We live in the most magnificent city in the world," the judge pronounced as he popped a fig into his mouth. "Today Baghdad overflows with refugees running away from the Mongol army. We provide them safe haven. This is the center of the world, don't you think, Baba Zaman? This city is a gem, no doubt," I said carefully, "but let us not forget that cities are like human beings. They are born, they go through childhood and adolescence, they grow old, and eventually they die. At this moment in time, Baghdad is in its late youth. We are not as wealthy as we used to be at the time of Caliph Harun ar-Rashid, though we can still take a measure of pride in being a center of trade, crafts, and poetry. But who knows what the city will look like 1,000 years from now? Everything might be different." Such pessimism. The judge shook his head as he reached out to another bowl and picked a date. "The Abbasid rule will prevail, and we will prosper. That is, of course, if the status quo is not disrupted by the traitors among us. There are those who call themselves Muslim, but their interpretation of Islam is far more dangerous than threats from infidels." I chose to remain silent. It was no secret that the judge thought the mystics, with their individualistic and esoteric interpretations of Islam, were troublemakers. He accused us of paying no heed to the Sharia and thus disrespecting the men of authority, men like him. Sometimes I had the feeling he would rather have all Sufis kicked out of Baghdad. "Your brotherhood is harmless, but don't you think some Sufis are beyond the pale?" the judge asked, stroking his beard. I didn't know how to respond to that. Thank God! Just then we heard a knock on the door. It was the ginger-haired novice. He made a beeline toward me and whispered in my ear that we had a visitor, a wandering dervish who insisted upon seeing me and refused to talk to anyone else. Normally I would have asked the novice to take the newcomer to a quiet, welcoming room, give him warm food, and make him wait until the guests had left. But as the judge was giving me a hard time, it occurred to me that a wandering dervish could dispel the tension in the room by telling us colorful stories from faraway lands. So I asked the novice to bring the man in. A few minutes later, the door opened and in walked a man dressed head to toe in black. Lank, gaunt, and of indeterminable age, he had a sharp nose, deeply set pitch-black eyes, and dark hair that fell over his eyes in thick curls. He wore a long, hooded cloak, a wool garment, and sheepskin boots. There were a number of charms around his neck. He held a wooden bowl in his hand of the sort that mendicant dervishes carry to overcome their personal vanity and hubris by accepting the charity of others. I realized that here was a man who did not pay much attention to the judgments of society. That people could confuse him with some vagrant, or even a beggar, didn't he seem to bother him in the least. As soon as I saw him standing there, awaiting permission to introduce himself, I sensed he was different. It was in his eyes, in his elaborate gestures, written all over him, like an acorn that might seem modest and vulnerable to ignorant eyes but already heralds the proud oak tree that it will turn out to be. He looked at me with those piercing black eyes and nodded silently. "Welcome to our lodge, dervish," I said as I motioned for him to take a seat on the cushions across from me. After greeting everyone, the dervish sat down, inspecting the people in the room, taking in every detail. Finally his gaze stopped at the judge. The two men looked at each other for a full minute, without so much as a word, and I couldn't help wondering what each thought of the other, as they seemed so very opposite. I offered the dervish warm goat milk, sweetened figs, and filled dates, all of which he politely refused. When asked his name, he introduced himself as Shams of Tabriz and said he was a wandering dervish searching for God high and low. "And were you able to find him?" I inquired. A shadow crossed his face as the dervish nodded and said, "Indeed, he was with me all along." The judge interjected with a smirk he didn't bother to hide, "I never understand why you dervishes make life so complicated. If God was with you all along, why did you rummage around this whole time in search of him?" Shams of Tabriz bowed his head pensively and remained silent for a moment. When he looked up again, his face was calm, his voice measured. "Because although it is a fact that he cannot be found by seeking, only those who seek can find him." Such wordplay, the judge scoffed. "Are you trying to tell us that we cannot find God if we stay in the same place all our lives? That's nonsense. Not everyone needs to dress in tatters and hit the road like you." There followed a ripple of laughter as the men in the room were eager to show their agreement with the judge. High-pitched, unconfident, and unhappy laughs from people used to toadying to superiors. I felt uneasy. Obviously it hadn't been a good idea to bring the judge and the dervish together. Perhaps I was misunderstood. I didn't mean to say one could not find God if he stayed in his hometown. "That is certainly possible," conceded the dervish. "There are people who have never traveled anywhere and yet have seen the world." "Exactly." The judge grinned triumphantly, a grin that vanished upon hearing what the dervish uttered next. "What I meant to say, Judge, was that one could not find God if he stayed in the fur coat, silk garment, and pricey jewelry that you are wearing today." A stunned silence descended upon the room, the sounds and sighs around us dissolving down to dust. We all held our breath, as if expecting something bigger to happen, though what?